if you don't mind, I would pose the very first question because we've been talking a great deal about Chinese IR, Chinese international theories. So for the starters, how would you define the concept? Like very brief, with a few sentences, how would you define it? Because some people would perhaps think that Chinese IR only like it refers to all the people, all the mainland China people living in mainland China who have like ethnic, who have like a Chinese ethnicity or something like that, and they are doing IR studies, or you would have people believing that that Chinese IR only relates to those scholars who are into indigenous Chinese IR theories, that exactly like just to refer to those 6 emerging theories. And then you would have some people arguing that Chinese IR refers to all Chinese scholars who might be into Western IR or Marxist IR or traditional Chinese IR, or then and then also including those who are indigenous, doing indigenous stuff. So sorry for saying this. I wasn't able to say this, pose my question with a few sentences, but the idea is just to think about what is the definition of Chinese IR for you guys? How would you define it with a very few sentences?
Well, at least in my thesis, I was focusing mainly on the theorization that is happening within the mainland China, because it seems to be connected somehow. Well, it is guided by the China's rise also. So these theories in mainland, they openly claim that they are trying to bring some intellectual contributions to support the rise of China. So I don't think Taiwanese would describe their works in a similar manner. So that's why I focused on the mainland discussions on Tianxia.
So you would exclude Taiwanese Chinese IR from the definition of Chinese?
Well, to some degree, yeah, because like I said, the mainland scholars typically would claim to, at least to some level, offer some intellectual support for the project of the rejuvenation of China or something like that. So yeah, I would differentiate the mainland scholars at least from other ethnic Chinese scholars.
Okay, what about Alvin? What is your definition?
Yeah, so for me, right, I rather not to define that. I want to keep it open. The reason is that first, right, if we want to define what is a Chinese IR theory, then we need to first define what is Chinese. That will take a long time. And then we have to define what is IR, what's international relations, right? And then we have to define what is theory. So all this debate, then when we have the definitions of all these 3 words, then we can really define what Chinese IR theories. So I rather to keep it open. So anyone can, come up with their own definition. So it's a pluralist approach. So as my argument before, I think Chinese IR theory or theories actually is more accurate because it's not monolithic, right? So I want to keep the definitions as wider, as broad as possible. So Chinese IR theories.
I argue that the Chinese indigenous theory, it means the theory created by the scholars of mainland China. But I know that a lot of scholars, Hong Kong scholars and Taiwan scholars, they also made a very good contribution. But we have very different values, and we serve for different governments. So in my mind, in my paper, I argue that the Chinese IR theory means the theory created by the scholars of mainland China. But I admit that the scholars living in other countries the Chinese scholars living in other countries also made a very good contribution.
I could actually pose another question. I was wondering, you mentioned that quite many Chinese theories seem to be drawing upon Confucianism. And then again, you start to think that, hey, there are other intellectual resources that one could draw upon. So, should there be, I was just wondering, like what other kinds of intellectual resources one could discover or excavate in Chinese intellectual history? Taoism, Buddhism, and so on and so on. What is your take on this?
Well, I was actually thinking about kind of the same question when Weizhan was talking about that most of the IR theories in China are focusing on Confucianism, and it kind of makes sense because the way I also see the IR theories in China is that they are somehow, at least the Tianxia theory is used at some level also as a kind of a soft power device. So it's tried to be presented as some kind of a benevolent Chinese worldview to displace the evil Western version of the international order. So in that sense, Confucianism makes sense because it's at least at the face value, it seems nice and harmonious and emphasizes peace and pacifism and stuff like that. So if you would like to create a Chinese IR theory and try to gain some soft power benefits with it, then I would not try to do that with legalism. So like neo-legalism would have kind of a bad clang in it. But I don't know, it could be developed, I don't know.
Yes, so I just want to add, right? So it seems like the way they present in the so-called Chinese IR theory on Confucianism is kind of monolithic also, right? So in my, when I study, the so-called Confucianism, I see different variants also within the Confucians traditions. So it's not like one size, this is Confucianism. So what is Confucianism? It's also highly contested. So we should actually open these boundaries, right? So not only, and I also think that those IR theory, they tend to be from the northern perspective, from northern China's perspective. If you're looking from, southern China, for example, from Guangdong, from Fujian, from Guangxi or Zhejiang, it looks very different. So I actually see that, the actual practice of how they deal with international relation theory, for example, Wenzhou business people, Hokkien business people, also Guangdong business people, their international practice also, it's like a theory, but then we don't consider that as theory. I think that's very, it's a shame, I think, it would be better if we can incorporate, actually, there's so many indigenous perspectives in China. But then, I think it's been people most attention are paid to Confucianism, and the only one form of Confucianism. I think that's the fundamental problem. I wish that they can draw more from other regions. For example, regional culture, local cultures, right? In southern China, in southwestern China. For example, if you're from Chengdu, you look at international relation very differently, and you also practice very differently. So as someone posted in the forum, right? So we need to talk about ontology, epistemology, and so on and so forth, and paradigm. But I think that the practice is also very important, not only epistemology and ontology, because the reason is that if we follow this framework, right, we follow back to Eurocentrism. So why do we need to start a theory with ontology and epistemology and also methodology? Maybe we don't need that. We can look at the practice.
Okay.
So just a thought.
Oh yeah, it's a very fruitful thought. Yeah, so I wonder, we don't have that much time left. So I was wondering if you guys have some question that you would like to pose for another. Do you have something that you would like to ask Weizhan, Matti, Alvin? Do you have some questions?
Yeah, so I have a question, right? So it's going back to for Weizhan. So you mentioned about, there's big differences between Chinese, values and then the Western values. But I think that it tend to be overstressed. So as I presented, right, Chinese IR, they also try to move up the global value chain. So in my perspective, I see more similarities than differences. I mean, if they're that different, so why do they try to publish in the Anglo-Saxon, media, in the Anglo-Saxon publishers and journals? Why they don't come up with a Chinese index, right? If the values are actually that different. And then why they try to move up the global ranking? Why they don't do a Confucians, index of ranking, right? Like a Tianxia ranking, right? So the ranking index will be very different. When you look at 仁义礼智信, right? All this, like, for example, the Confucians value, right? Benevolent, humanity, right? And filial piety. Then we have different ranking index. But then you can see Chinese university, also Chinese IR, they try to going up the value chain. So why is that, if that's actually that difference? So I would actually like to challenge the idea that, they actually following the Confucians value. On the contrary, I think they actually like most people, for the most people, if you look at from anthropological practice, right? From anthropological perspective, they no longer follow Confucian's values.
The conflict here, I mean, between countries, between the government, between the Chinese government and the government of other countries, especially the Sino-US relations. So although China is trying to reform and open up, but we can see that now the value differences between China and other countries is increasing, not decreasing. The logic of the state building of China and other states are quite the same, are quite different. In China, the power is from top to bottom, but in Western countries, the power is from bottom to the top. So that is why the Chinese and people of other countries have very different understanding of China's Hong Kong policy and the China's Taiwan policy. So I'm afraid that in the future, with the rise of China, the conflict will be increasing. So I'm not very optimistic about it. I'm sorry.
Alvin, you showed us all these graphs of how many students have, how the amounts of students to China have increased, and how these Chinese IR books have been published in Western by Western well-known publishers. But how successful do you think these Chinese IR theories have been so far? I mean, they have been developed for 15 years or 20 years or so, and yes, books have been translated in English in which their ideas are explained, but basically they are used in the West mainly to understand how the Chinese scholars are thinking, but nobody, at least to my knowledge, is using Chinese IR theory as like a framework for the studies, like for a dissertation study in here. So, I mean, how successful do you think so far that this project to sell the Chinese IR theory and move it up the value chain has been so far?
I think it has been moderately successful. As before, right? I say it's a marketing segmentation. What I mean by that is that they don't try to mass marketing, right? So it's not that they sell on Amazon, then they will be the best seller. So that's not their marketing strategy. So they are targeting at the top university, especially in the English-speaking countries. So to really enter the discourse, right? So they're aiming at the scholars and also students and policy circles. So in that regard, it actually, has some voices now, and then it's on its way, moving up. And in terms of the dissertation you mentioned about, in fact, I see more and more people write on Chinese IR theory. They might not apply it, but then they cite it, and then they also study it, right? Oh, you too, right? I also do that. And then so many people, so it's like my argument is that it doesn't really matter what he argues, right? I think Xin Li in the panel, he posed the question, we should talk about ontology, epistemology, methodology. But the idea is that from a marketing perspective, it doesn't really matter. What it is, it doesn't really matter. It's to, penetrate into the global market. It's like a sell product in the top end, right? At the top university in your curriculum, whether it can explain the world or not explain the world, whether it's IR or not IR, doesn't really matter. It's about branding. So that's my argument.
Alvin, I have some questions to you. Firstly, I think that we know that now the Chinese universities put some emphasis on the publication in English, but we also know that the IR scholars cannot publish so many English articles. We have no compared with other disciplines such as science, engineering, and public affairs and economy. We only publish very little amount of, we only publish a very small amount of English articles. So the Chinese IR scholars cannot make much contribution to the upgrade of the ranking of Chinese universities.
But then, I mean, you have the journal established by the Tsinghua University, right? The Journal of Chinese International Politics. So it's a very successful journal, and more foreigners actually want to publish there.
Right? But we only have one journal. The one journal cannot change the ranking of the university.
Yeah, but then, it will like rising, right? As I said, it's moving on its way, moving up to the value chain. And then when there's more demand, they will publish Chinese scholars, papers. So I mean, publishers want their book to sell, right? So when the demand curve shift, also, the publication will come out. So I predict that in the next 5 years, there will be more Chinese, IR scholars publish their work in English, just as in other discipline. We can see that in engineering already. I mean, in science, they already, dominating, like not dominating, but actually a very influential role in the SCI index. China, right? They are ahead of, even Germany, France, Japan.
Yeah, but now the guidance policy is changing. We know that just 1 month or 2 months ago, the General Secretary said that please publish your articles within China in Chinese. 把论文发在中国大地上. Please do not publish English articles. Yeah.
Yeah. I just completely agree with Alvin that if the idea of Chinese IR theory is just to kind of spread out the Chinese concepts to penetrate the discourses in the West, and then in that sense it has been successful to some degree. I mean, more and more people in the Western scholarly communities, they know like the word Tianxia. Maybe they don't maybe know anything more about it, but at least they know the word. So to me, many of these elements in these Chinese theories, first of all, of course, the Tianxia, they seem to me like memes, like meme in the original meaning of Richard Dawkins, not an internet meme, but a replicating idea that gets to be replicated from brain to brain. The Tianxia to me seems like a meme in this sense, that the Chinese higher community is trying to spread everywhere, that get this idea of Tianxia in your head and talk about it and discuss it. But as Xingli mentioned in the chat, we still only discuss Tianxia and other theories in the West in trying to understand how the Chinese scholars think and how the Chinese government think. But we do not try to, analyze or explain world politics through their frameworks, because they don't offer any, well-developed frameworks for doing so compared to, let's say, neorealism by Kenneth Waltz or those frameworks. I don't use them myself, but I just want to point out that it's not the same that you get your concepts, spread it into the discussions, and that people do actual science with them. So if you know what I mean, if you get what I mean.
If I can ask very quickly, so do you think, guys, that those concepts like Tianxia, they don't actually travel that well? That, like in comparative political science, it's all about, the main question when you're dealing with concepts is always that, does this concept, does this theory travel from one context to another? Can we actually explain some other theories? Or alternatively, are these concepts and theories only designed just for very, contextual purposes, that, you can only apply them in the Chinese context? And, do you see any future for like these kinds of theories, like that they could actually be able to become more, travel able in that sense? Or do you see that kind of future where, Chinese IR, these kinds of Chinese IR will be, more popular in mainland China, but it will not be, even though it will be, like Matti said, it will be proliferating, it will be spreading around. But when it comes to actual explaining world politics, to coming up with universalist theories, we might not see similar successful. So do these concepts and theories travel?
I'm not very familiar with the concept of Tianxia, but okay, I'll talk about it later. Okay, sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
What about Alvin?
So I want to return to Weizhan's question. He posed the questions, right, about now they have this new policy that to encourage Chinese scholars to publish in China. But I want to so I will actually argue that, right? You argue that the Chinese system works like top down, but I will actually argue that it works both way, both top down and bottom up. So in the Chinese saying, in the proverb, they say that 上有政策,下有对策, right? So you can have a top-down policy, but then the people, will respond differently. So the same argument goes. So you have a top-down policy, say that, publish more in China. But however, the researchers, they can choose. So it's the bottom-up processes. So going back to economics, right? When we look at Chinese economic development, especially in the coastal area, is that they have the top-down policy. However, the local government, the local entrepreneur, the local business people, and the civil societies, they actually follow a different path. It's through the negotiations with the central government. So what I'm saying is that you can have a top-down policy, but then how people respond will be very different. It's the same with Belt and Road Initiative, right? Since we're talking about IR. So you can have a top-down or a vision, right? So Belt and Road Initiative, but then how people mobilize this idea very differently, drastically. For example, someone in EU might interpret BRI very differently than someone from Guangdong. And someone will look at BRI very different in Chongqing than in Beijing. So they have various interests. So I don't think there's actually the national interest. I think that the interests are very diverse in China with different actors at different levels. So I think the bottom-up process are also very important. So going back to the publication, I think that many Chinese scholars still and will publish in English.
Let's go to theory on a Chinese IR. So do you think your theory can be compared with other countries that are doing the same thing, that would be discovering similar patterns, similar correlations, if we were to look into, let's say, Russia or India or some other countries that you would find, to be comparable with China? Or do you think that this is, one of those theories that can only be applied in Chinese context? So what is your take on that?
So you're talking about my take on Chinese IR theory or the theory itself?
No, I'm talking about I was calling it, let's call it an argument. Do you think that your argument can be like compared so that, it can be applied in different contexts, other than just in Chinese context? That would we be looking into similar patterns in Russia or India or other countries?
I think Russia is not a good case, but then I think South Korea is a good case. South Korea also tried to moving up in the global value chain. And in higher education, right? Also India, they try to publish in those like index, social science citation index and high ranking. So that's why Asian university jumped a lot. That's why, it's bad for Canadian universities. Our ranking declined because of the rise of Asia, not only China. We have to realize that right now it's the rise of Asia. So South Korea, Indonesia, so not only China, right? And then I think this argument, moving up the global value chain, actually fits. And Korea has done really well. For example, you can look at Korean pop. They managed to move up really fast, right? I mean, a few decades ago, nobody knows Korean pop in the West, but now they really dominate the market. Mm-hmm. So then whether Chinese IR will be the new, like a Chinese pop, I don't know. We will see how the markets, right? But then that argument can also apply to Indonesia, as I mentioned before.
Okay.
And other countries.
On my behalf, thank you to Weizhan, thank you to Matti and Alvin for York University, for their Asian Center. Thank you very much. It was my delight to act as the moderator and the discussant. Thank you. 谢谢. Kiitoksia.
Thank you.